Good morning, everyone. On the surface, Love's Labour's Lost is a light, frothy play about a French king and 3 of his gentlemen who vow to study abstemiously for 3 years, only to change their minds when a French princess and 3 of her ladies arrive. The men begin to woo the ladies, but their wooing is, for the time being, unsuccessful, which is why it is Love's Labour's Lost. On the surface, the story of this play appears to be one of the few for which Shakespeare doesn't have a source. But of course, appearances can be deceptive. For 150 years, scholars and researchers in England and France and America have dipped into this play and uncovered a number of overt and covert allusions to a historical academy, names and characteristics of historical figures, and the visit of a French princess to Navarre, as well as recognising the play's distinctly French feel. Indeed, Francis Yates, an authority on 16th century French literature, writes, "Everyone is agreed that Love's Labour's Lost is one of the most topical of all Shakespeare's plays, that it bristles throughout with allusions to contemporary events." Our investigation of this most topical play begins in Paris. It was there that in 1562, at the command of Catherine de Medici, that the poet Pierre de Ronsard put forward his suggestion for an institution or establishment for young King Charles IX. This institution was without precedent in France. Its members met once a week and were devoted above all to poetry and music, because, as Ronsard put it, "Sire, ce n'est pas tout que d'être roi de France. Un roi, pour être grand, ne doit rien ignorer." Charles IX's academy lasted 5 years. In 1576, under his successor and brother, Henri III, the academy was restored and enlarged. Subjects included philosophy, poetry, and discussions about tragedy and comedy. Nor was this Académie du Palais, the Palace Academy, the only one in Paris. For example, another ran under the auspices of the poet Jean-Antoine de Beth. Surviving lists tell us those who attended included diplomats, scientists, doctors, lawyers, many titled people, the brothers of the king, and one we shall meet imminently, the sister of the king, and hence a princess, Marguerite de Valois. There seems to have been a livre d'institution, an institution book. Abel Lefranc, a French scholar from the first half of the 20th century, as Julia has already mentioned, tells us that le roi, les princes, les seigneurs et tous les savants avaient tout signé dans ce livre. One of the signatories was the Protestant and poet Agrippa d'Aubigné. It is d'Aubigné who tells us that there was an academy at the court of Navarre, in the south of France, formed in imitation of the Palace Academy. So now we turn to Love's Labour's Lost and the play's King of Navarre, who in the opening speech of the play sets the scene.
"Navarre shall be the wonder of the world. Our court shall be a little academy, still and contemplative in living art. You 3, Baron, Domain and Longueville, have sworn for 3 years' term to live with me, my fellow scholars, and to keep those statutes that are recorded in this schedule here. Your oaths are passed, and now subscribe your names, that his own hand may strike his honour down that violates the smallest branch herein. If you are armed to do as sworn to do, subscribe to your deep oaths and keep it too."
Thank you. An academy at the court of Navarre and the men signing to it. It sounds familiar. You'll have noticed the number of men signing, 4. This may, suggest the Shakespeare scholars, be based upon Pierre de la Primaude's book, L'Académie Française. It was published in French in 1577 and translated into English by 1586. It tells of a little academy of 4 young men from Anjou, placed under the tuition of a master to learn Latin and Greek and the philosophy of wise men. This little academy may or may not have existed, but Thomas Bow's English translation is useful for traditional scholars who are source hunting, and it may have been Shakespeare's source for the idea of an academy of 4 gentlemen. What is more certain and agreed is that a number of historical figures are alluded to in the play. One is the King of Navarre in the late 1570s and 1580s. He would eventually become Henri IV of France. The King of Navarre was a Protestant most of the time, and consequently intermittently involved in skirmishes with the Catholic King of France. And he did indeed have an academy at his court for a period of time. His contemporaries included the Maréchal de Biron. Father and son held that title. The name resembles Berun or Beraun in Love's Labour's Lost. It is probably the son, Charles de Gontaut, who is alluded to here. Another contemporary was the Duc de Mayenne, at one point an opponent of the King of Navarre, but later a valuable supporter. The most recent Arden editor, Woodhusen, sees him as the source for the name Dumaine. However, writing in 1981 on the French influence in Shakespeare's plays, Hugh Richmond considers the Maréchal d'Aumont to be a more likely model for Dumaine. Both names resemble Dumaine, another of the 3 men in the King's Academy in Love's Labour's Lost. A third contemporary was Henri d'Orléans, Duc de Longueville, whom scholars identify with Longueville in the play. In the first scene of Love's Labour's Lost, the King of Navarre, Berun, Dumaine and Longueville are all lined up to sign the oath. All 4 characters allude to Frenchmen in the 1580s. Other historical figures, men, include Marcadet and Boyer, names found in contemporary French records. Antoine Boyer was a treasurer to the French king. And we might also note Fénelon, Seigneur de la Motte, who was the French ambassador in 1568 to 75. The historical figures apparently alluded to in the play are not only male. Marguerite de Valois was a sister to the French king, and therefore a princess. She was married to Henri, King of Navarre, and so also a queen. This dual status may accidentally be reflected in the play when it is a princess who visits the King of Navarre, because the play also uses the speech prefix queen in Acts 2 and Acts 4. In the play, the princess is accompanied by 3 ladies, Maria, Catherine and Rosaline. Now it so happens that in real life, the Duc de Longueville was married to a Marie de Navarre. In the play, Longueville is paired with Maria. And curiously, the historical King of Navarre had a sister Catherine, who was related to the d'Alençon line. Catherine may allude to that in the play when she says of Dumaine, "I saw him at the Duke Alençon's once." On the other hand, Marguerite de Valois and her ladies had visited her brother, the Duc d'Alençon, in 1578, and the playwright might be referencing that visit instead. A historical equivalent for Rosaline isn't obvious, but in the play it is she who mentions Brabant. Liège was just inside the area known as Brabant, and a place the real princess and her female entourage had visited on tour earlier in 1578. And Rosaline is paired with Berun, and they have this exchange. "Did I not dance with you in Brabant once? Did I not dance with you in Brabant once?" And repetition, of course, is usually significant in Shakespeare. This map shows Marguerite de Valois' journey. Brabant was at one point a duchy, an area in the Low Countries. So there are potentially 10 historical personages reflected in the play. But let's return to the concept of the academies. The Paris academies were attended by women, unlike the one in the play. In Love's Labour's Lost, before he signs, Berun puts his finger on what he sees as a problem.
But there are other strict observances, as not to see a woman in that term, which I hope, is not enrolled there, and 1 day in a week to touch no food, and but 1 meal on every day beside, the which I hope is not enrolled there, and then to sleep but 3 hours in the night, and not be seen to wink of all the day, when I was wont to think no harm all night, and make a dark night too of half the day, which I hope well is not enrolled there. All these are barren tasks, too hard to keep, not to see ladies, study, fast, not sleep.
For any member of the English audience familiar with Henri of Navarre's reputation, the oath to stay away from women would have been a huge joke, for as Buller puts it, the king was notorious for his love affairs, and I'm advised not to mention any presidents of current France. We now turn to a historical event, the visit of the Princess of France, Marguerite de Valois, to the court of Navarre. Now, her visit is recorded in her memoirs, and this is the frontispiece of them. They were published in French in 1628, far too late for any playwright wanting to draw upon that version for Love's Labour's Lost. Marguerite de Valois and her ladies travelled to the court of Navarre at Nérac in 1578. A host of scholars, Lee, Lefranc, Yeats, Buller, Richmond, for example, see this place echoed in the play, a French connection first explored in the late 19th century. In the play, no sooner have the king and two gentlemen signed up to 3 years' abstention and contemplation than Berowne points out a problem. He takes the document from the king and reads,
Item. If any man be seen to talk with a woman within the term of 3 years, he shall endure such public shame as the rest of the court can possibly devise. This article, my liege, yourself must break. For well you know, here comes in embassy the French king's daughter with yourself to speak, a maid of grace and complete majesty, about surrender up of Aquitaine to her decrepit, sick and bedrid father. Therefore this article is made in vain, or vainly comes to the admired princess hither.
Catherine de Medici, Marguerite's mother, travelled with her to Navarre in 1578 and actually made another trip in 1586. Both her visits were partly to discuss the question of Marguerite de Valois' dowry and Aquitaine, which Richard David and Abel Lefranc comment upon. The negotiations appear to be echoed in Love's Labour's Lost, because in Act 2, Scene 1, the king and princess refer to Aquitaine and a payment of 100,000 crowns to settle matters. In the historical records, it is clear that the bevy of ladies with Catherine de Medici were known as l'Escadron Volant, the Flying Squadron, a group of women, mostly daughters of smaller landed gentry, who used as many feminine wiles as necessary to bend the men to their desires. In her visit in 1586, Catherine de Medici was accompanied by des plus belles personnes de sa cour, the most beautiful members of her court, because she knew about Henri's inclination towards la galanterie, and she avoir compté sur elle pour le séduire, and she counted on them to seduce him. The Flying Squadron and their techniques are reported by several male French historians, Gérard and Brantôme, for example, with a mixture of awe and detail. They are daring women who seem to have brought about a French fashion for wearing revealing clothes, like this lady. They were powerful. Brantôme comments that a man was happy who could fall in love with such ladies, and just as happy if he could escape from their love. These women, this escadron volant, are what Richmond sees as providing the model for what he describes as Shakespeare's aggressive young women in Love's Labour's Lost. If 4 young men swear an oath to live without contact with women and 4 young women suddenly arrive, you might anticipate a dilemma. You might also anticipate a degree of repartee between the men and the women. 2 Frenchmen think that the playwright captures the peculiarly French tone and mood and style of this repartee. Lefranc quotes Montaigu on how it is extraordinary to see that Shakespeare est fidèle jusque dans les plus minutieux détails à la vérité historique et à la couleur locale. Tous les détails de cette pièce sont français. Lefranc himself comments, Love's Labour's Lost is an ingenious and complicated work, which assumes knowledge acquired through years of assimilation of the manners and ways of thinking of polite society, and a feeling for an especially French aristocratic environment. Richmond comments on the vivacity and confidence of some of Shakespeare's women in Love's Labour's Lost and elsewhere, reflecting the mood of the women in another French text, Marguerite d'Angoulême's Heptameron. This was published in French in 1558. It is a collection of some 70 tales of love between men and women, where the women usually best the men and are feisty individuals. Perhaps that influence is evident in the beginning of the first meeting in the play between the King of Navarre and the princess. They are standing somewhere out of doors, somewhere outside the King of Navarre's court. The princess is not exactly shy.
Fair princess, welcome to the court of Navarre.
Oh, fair I give you back again, and welcome I have not yet. The roof of this court is too high to be yours, and welcome to the wide fields, too base to be mine.
You shall be welcome, madam, to my court.
I will be welcome then. Conduct me hither.
Well, hear me. Dear lady, I have sworn an oath.
Ah, lady, help my lord, he'll be forsworn.
Not for the world, fair madam, by my will.
Why, will shall break it. Will, and nothing else.
Your ladyship is ignorant what it is.
Were my lord so, his ignorance were wise, where now his knowledge must prove ignorance. I hear your grace hath sworn out housekeeping. 'Tis deadly sin to keep that oath, my lord, and sin to break it. And pardon me, I am too sudden bold to teach a teacher, ill beseemeth me.
Thank you. Now we move to another apparent allusion to the court of Navarre. The Duc de Sully, a contemporary visitor to the court of Navarre, d'Aubigny, and Marguerite de Valois all write about the court's delights. Sully writes, "One gave oneself up to pleasure, feasting and fête galante, all of us given over to nothing but laughing, dancing and matchmaking." D'Aubigny, the writer who tells us about Henri's academy at Navarre, describes the entertainment. One after the other, Italian actors, clowns, lutists, violinists were requisitioned to entertain the chateau guests. The whole company went out of doors into the park, where we have just left our two previous speakers. Marguerite, in her memoirs, writes, "Our court at Nérac was so lovely and pleasant. The day was spent in all kinds of honourable pleasures, dancing usually taking place in the evening." Georges Lambin has no doubt that the court of Navarre's gardens are echoed here. In Love's Labour's Lost, the four men decide they prefer the pursuit of love to academic contemplation. And so Berun initiates the plans to entertain the ladies. It may well echo the entertainments found at Navarre. He says, "First from the park, let us conduct them thither. In the afternoon we will with some strange pastime solace them, such as the shortness of the time can shape, for revels, dances, masks, and merry hours forerun fair love, strewing her way with flowers." The French connection is also evident in some peculiarly precise details about three of the historic figures. Firstly, Henri. He was a womanizer, a horseman, and a huntsman. In Love's Labour's Lost, the princess observes the king as he spurred his horse so hard. In historical fact and in the play, he writes poetry. And he had a quaint habit of saving paper by writing in every direction on every corner of each page of his letter. We might remember this when in the play, the princess shows what she has from the king. "Look what I have from the loving king. As much love in rhyme as would be crammed up in a sheet of paper, writ o' both sides the leaf, margin and all, that he was fain to seal on Cupid's name." Secondly, the Princess of France, Marguerite de Valois. Richmond draws attention to her appearance. He refers to her Amazonian stature. A figure strong enough to carry robes whose weight would have crushed another woman, but which her large and ample figure supports so well. Perhaps this picture of her shows the type of heavyweight dress she could support. Her robustness may be referenced by Costard, who in Act 4 seeks the princess and asks, "Which is the greatest lady, the highest?" He repeats, "The thickest and the tallest," and tells the princess, "You are the thickest here." He is not exactly complimentary. Reputedly, too, Marguerite was fond of hunting. In the play, the princess happily asked the forester where she should stand for the hunt, or rather, "Where is the bush that we must stand and play the murderer in?" Thirdly, there is Biron. The historical Duc de Biron is described as being conscious of his own worth. He was learned and possessed of a superior wit, presumably pleasing to Henri of Navarre, who adored witticisms and puns. Rosaline notes Biron's merriness and wit. Richmond notes that Biron and Henri were in charge of separate forces at the siege of Amiens, Henri appearing just at the moment of victory. Furious, Biron claimed that the only useful thing the king had brought was his girlfriend. Indeed, the historical Biron would eventually offend the king for such outspoken words. The king had him executed. You may remember that in the play the king mocks Longueville and Dumaine when they infringe their oaths for women. But then Biron steps forward and mocks the king, who has turned sonneteer and fallen for the princess.
Now step I forth to whip hypocrisy. Ah, good my liege, I pray thee pardon me. Good heart, what grace hast thou thus to reprove these worms for loving that art most in love? Your eyes do make no coaches, in your tears there is no certain princess that appears. You'll not be perjured, 'tis a hateful thing. Tush, none but minstrels like of sonneting. But are you not ashamed?
As the king falls for the princess too. Furthermore, there are points in the play where a very precise knowledge of the French language is evident, suggesting that Kenneth Muir is right to see Shakespeare as a reader of French. One instance is when Holofernes the pedant complains that doubt and debt are pronounced doubt and debt. The playwright knows the English have taken these once Latin words through French and in the process adopted the French pronunciation. The playwright also throws in odd French phrases like sans question. He'd run puns dreadfully on l'envoi, a fat l'envoi. Aye, that's a fat goose, because the last part of l'envoi plays on the French word for goose, oie. Then Costard seeks to wriggle out of the charge of seducing Jacquinetta by saying he wasn't taken with a wench, but with a damsel. Damsel, of course, derives from demoiselle, French for an unmarried woman, and it's otherwise only used by Shakespeare about Joan of Arc. There's also a certain amount of punning on French branle, punning rather rude for a Sunday morning audience, but not too rude for Woodhousen's notes. And in the final lines of the play, in the Song of Ver, or Spring, the playwright refers to cuckoo buds of yellow hue. The plant is not certainly identified, says Woodhousen, but look up cuckoo or cuckoo in a French dictionary, and we found that cuckoo is a cowslip, which is indeed of yellow hue. If we begin to draw these threads together, we find a playwright who is confident in reading French and demonstratively familiar with events and figures at the French court of Navarre, dating from 1578. This playwright may not have a direct source, but he is borrowing extensively. His play is bristling with topical allusions to French history and literature. It is true that there are elements from the Commedia dell'arte, such as the stock figures of the braggart and pedant in Armado and Holofernes. There are also elements which reflect English events, such as visits from Russians to the English court, a play performed in Chester, and possibly to Raleigh's School of Night. But at the forefront is the use of French figures, many of them alive at the time of publication in Love's Labour's Lost in 1598. There is a location at the court of Navarre, events at the court of Navarre, a court whose academy did exist in the late 1570s and early 1580s. There are a range of cross-references to French events and characters, and there is play with the French language itself. Today, we find Shakespeare's French connections in Love's Labour's Lost in a range of sources from that century. There's the French language itself, there's de la Primaude's book, Marguerite's memoirs, Sully's and d'Aubigny's accounts of the court's evening pleasures, and the state papers, foreign. But we can hardly suggest that these were all accessible to Shakespeare. The only one easily accessible to an ordinary English reader then would have been Primaude's book, translated in 1586. Although it is seen as an early play, Love's Labour's Lost is a sophisticated fusion of covert and overt allusions to at least these, or to someone's knowledge of French academies and court life, and to Marguerite de Valois' visit to Navarre and her travels. The play is truly elusive in the Elizabethan sense of a riddle or jest, for parts of the play's interest depend on the audience appreciating the allusions. Holofernes even uses allusion in that sense of riddle. So what have scholars and critics made of Love's Labour's Lost and its French connections? Yeats' comment about the play bristling with topical allusions is clearly correct. John Dover Wilson echoes bristling in his 1962 edition. We have touched just briefly on the probable identification of those allusions, but as Woodhusen says, if Shakespeare was alluding to current history, his version of it is far from straightforward. The historical king of Navarre was an Henri, not a King Ferdinand as in the play. The three men apparently referenced were not even all consistently on the historical king's side in the religious wars. The visit to his court was by a princess of France, but one who was also already the wife of the king of Navarre. And Marguerite's visit to Navarre was curtailed by the death of her brother, the Duc d'Alençon, not by the death of the king and father of the princess as in the play. Yeats too was surprised that the men weren't all supporters of Henri. She commented that if Shakespeare intended those names to represent contemporary French history, he carried out his intention in a singularly muddle-headed or else wilfully frivolous manner. Muddle-headed or wilfully frivolous? The playwright may have executed these changes, these differences, quite deliberately. A decade later, Chapman wrote two plays about Biron, soldier and latterly supporter of the King of Navarre, and those plays were so precise in their allusions to the French court that the French ambassador complained. The plays were censored, and Chapman called the results poor dismembered poems. There is some evidence to indicate that the 1598 quarter of Love's Labour's Lost was a revised play. It has newly corrected and augmented on the title page, and we've already noted two labels, Princess and Queen, for the same character. The quarto may have been corrected and augmented for publication, just enough to avoid cross-references to the King of Navarre's court, which were too precise, especially since by 1598 he was Henri IV of France as well. Concerns about censorship would explain newly corrected. Of course, no writer making use of recent events has to present them historically accurately. Dare I mention the television programme Allo Allo, or even Private Eye. Besides, an English audience in the know might have been amused to see a King of Navarre apparently signing up to an oath to have no contact with women for 3 years and breaking that oath almost instantly. The real king was known to be fickle in love and religion. By 1598, Henri had 3 children by a mistress, none by his wife. And Protestant Henri had changed to Catholicism a second time to be acceptable as the king of the whole of France, supposedly saying, Paris vaut bien une messe. Paris is well worth a mass. Hibbert comments that an Elizabethan audience in the mid-90s, 1590s, would not have missed the parallels between the men's perjuries in the play and Henri IV's abjuration of Protestantism in 1593. Dover Wilson probably has it about right when he says, Shakespeare is jesting throughout, poking fun, not attacking. His aim is to keep his audience, a select one, in fits of laughter. Lefranc studies these historical links and more, and simply states, there then is the conundrum solved of love's labours lost, the equivalence of the two situations entirely established, that of history and that of the Shakespearean comedy. And he does write at the side, that puts us, I do dare decidedly to say, at an infinite distance from William Shakespeare of Stratford. Indeed, he was so convinced the play was written by somebody with a personal knowledge of the King of Navarre and his court, that he wrote sous le masque to Shakespeare, arguing that William Stanley, Earl of Derby, wrote the play instead. Yeats, looking at all contemporary allusions, mentions the Earl of Derby as a possible author, and would then see Holofernes representing Derby's tutor, Richard Lloyd. Or, on the other hand, the Earl of Oxford as author would seem to favour Harvey as Holofernes. Both Lefranc and Yeats were thoroughly familiar with historical events in France, and were convinced that the writer of the play must be too. However, as Julia said, Woodhusen, noting the differences between historical fact and the play, said, none of this suggests Shakespeare was writing a topical play. It is true that by 1598 the visit by Marguerite de Valois to Navarre was some 20 years earlier, but Woodhusen does see the play including some more recent English allusions to revels at Gray's Inn in 1594-5. It is allusions to English events that Woodhusen emphasises. We may wonder why recent scholarship plays down the French connection. How did the playwright acquire the knowledge of late 16th century France that the play displays? Surely it cannot be dismissed as coincidence. Traditional scholars have traditional explanations. Sir Sidney Lee and Richard David, for example, comment on how in 1589 English troops were sent out to help the then Protestant King of Navarre in his claim to the Catholic throne of France. Essex, the Earl of Essex, was sent out in 1591. Troops were withdrawn in 1593. Hence, gossip about the court of Navarre may have been available to the author, for the King of Navarre was very much in the Elizabethan news. Letters in the state papers, foreign, confirm that Henri of Navarre was in the news in the late 1580s and the 1590s. Unsurprisingly, therefore, E.K. Chambers thinks Shakespeare obtained his historically accurate details from some English or French traveller. Dover Wilson doesn't offer an explanation so much as an exclamation to credit this amazing piece of virtuosity to one whose education was nothing more than what a grammar school and residence in the little provincial borough could provide, is to invite one either to believe in miracles or to disbelieve in the man from Stratford. John Munro reports on Campbell's view that Shakespeare heard it all in some great house. Buller comments, many Englishmen in London have been in France, and Shakespeare may have got the information from them about Navarre's habits as huntsman, letter writer and lover. Richmond suggests that Shakespeare would have gathered all of the historical information himself by a little research and careful questioning of his contemporaries. Richmond even says that Shakespeare might have acquired his detailed knowledge by travel there himself. Hibbard accepts that the festive atmosphere of the court of Navarre contributed to the festive nature of Love's Labours Lost, even though Shakespeare could only have learnt about it through gossip and rumour. At present, we do not know how the playwright gathered such a wide range of historical facts and wove them into such a sophisticated and elusive play, and this talk cannot and does not cover all the allusions. But there is at least agreement that this play draws significantly upon actual historical figures and events. Richmond, 1981, underlines that borrowing. The malicious games and switched identities with which Shakespeare's young women afflict their lovers are not Shakespeare's improvisations, but transcriptions of the sexual virtuosity of Marguerite's female shock troops. The women in Love's Labours Lost are prototypes of Shakespeare's virtuoso heroines in his mature comedies. Berune is based on the bravura of Charles de Gontaut, Duc de Béron. Indeed, Richmond's own investigations into the playwright's debts to French figures and the court of Navarre lead him to emphasise not Shakespeare's creative powers, but his knowledge of French courts. And he declares that in Love's Labour's Lost, truth exceeds the scope of fiction, and it is Shakespeare's genius to have copied, not invented, such psychologies. For Richmond, Sidney Lee, Buller, Hibbard, Dover Wilson, Lefranc, Yeats and David, inter alia, the composer of Love's Labour's Lost has a remarkably strong French connection.